Thank you, everyone, for coming today. This is Bonnie Youn of the Georgia Asian American and Pacific Islander Task Force. And today we have the honor of having Attorney Dale Minami. He had come to Georgia specifically to help us celebrate Georgia's inaugural Fred Korematsu Day and also our 2014 Asian American and Pacific Islander Day at the Georgia Capitol. But unfortunately, due to weather conditions, the day had to be postponed till next week on February 6, 2014. And fortunately, Karen Korematsu herself, the daughter of Fred Korematsu, will be able to join us on that day. But we wanted to be able to take this opportunity to have Dale Minami share with us what he wanted to be able to share with our larger audience. And so thank you so much to the law firm of Sutherland, Asbill & Brennan for agreeing to host us today, and also for Mr. S.K. Hong of News and Post for being able to videotape this segment today for us. So welcome, Dale. Thank you for coming to Atlanta for our Snowmageddon.
I'm pleased to be here despite the Mother Nature's gift to us.
Well, we thank you for your good humor and graciousness. And unfortunately, I know you won't be able to join us next week when Karen Korematsu comes, but we wanted to give you this opportunity today to share with us a little bit about who you are and your fantastic, legendary work within the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, particularly for the case work you did for Fred Korematsu. So I'd like to start off by asking you to tell us or share a little bit with us who you are and what your background is, and then we can go on to talk about the Korematsu case.
Well, I'm an attorney practicing law in San Francisco, California, and I grew up in California, in Southern California, went to the University of Southern California, then Boalt Hall Law School in Berkeley, and stayed up in the Bay Area. After law school, I helped start a public interest law firm called the Asian Law Caucus, and after that I went into private practice, and that's when we found out about Fred Korematsu's case.
Okay. And can you give us a little bit of a background on the executive order that ordered the Japanese Americans to report to these internment camps during World War II?
Sure. We know in December 7th, 1941, the imperial forces of Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor. But years before that, centuries of discrimination against first Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans essentially led to the internment or incarceration of Japanese Americans. After Pearl Harbor was born, all Japanese Americans became suspect. And the president then issued an executive order which required, in essence, 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry to prisons without trial, without a hearing, without notice of any charges at all. Among them were my family, my parents, my then one-year-old brother, who were deemed a military risk. And so the rationale of military necessity, or national security as they call it now, propelled the move to have Japanese Americans placed into first horse stalls where my family were put, and then later into internment or incarceration in the 10 other regions of the United States, in God-forsaken places where they served an indeterminate sentence until they were released. The confusion about who was an American and who was not an American, who was loyal to Japan and who was not, was monumental, because we were confused as Japanese because of our ethnic affiliations with the quote enemy. And as a result, with the kind of racism that occurred on the West Coast, the executive order that was issued by President Roosevelt on February 19th, 1942, created a civil rights disaster for this country, and especially for Japanese Americans.
And that's really moving to hear that your family was also impacted by the exclusion order. So Dale, why don't you tell us a little bit about Fred Korematsu? Who was he?
Well, Fred Korematsu was one of the 120,000 Japanese Americans, but he was a bit different. He was one of 3 men who stood up to refuse the military orders and did not report to camps as he was supposed to. He was arrested, he was convicted, and essentially sent to the concentration camps at a later date. He was only in the early 20s. He was living in San Leandro near San Francisco, California. He was a welder by trade, an ordinary man. What he believed it was done to Japanese Americans with the orders that pertained to him were absolutely wrong. He felt in his heart that this is not something that he should obey, and he felt that he should be treated like every other American, and he simply refused to obey those orders.
And Fred Korematsu, he is a native-born American citizen, correct?
Yes, Fred was born in the United States. He was born in Oakland. Fred also tried to enlist in the Coast Guard and other military services, but he was rejected because his draft card was denominated alien. And so Japanese Americans who were citizens of this country were considered aliens even by their own government officially in the selective service cards that they held.
So tell us about how Korematsu's conviction ultimately went up to the Supreme Court and was actually upheld as constitutional at that time.
Fred went to trial on his case, and the case was very simple. Are you Japanese Americans? And are you Japanese American, and did you refuse the military orders? The answer was yes, yes, very simple. So he lost his case, and he wanted to appeal. He knew he would get a measure of justice in the United States Supreme Court, the highest court of our land. But when his case finally got up there, his case was accompanied by two other cases earlier on, Gordon Hirabayashi and Minoru Yasui, who also refused the military orders. So when his case got up there, already Gordon Hirabayashi had lost his case, so did Minoru Yasui. But Fred was confident that he would get some measure of justice. So he took his case to the Supreme Court, but in a very weak decision, he lost. And I say we because it is criticized universally in the aftermath of the decision. It was based on half-truths, exaggerations, some outright lies. And basically the court ruled that your ethnic affiliation can predispose you to disloyalty if you're American of Japanese ancestry. So he was very, very disappointed, and the decision was weak in so many ways. It was internally contradictory, it was externally contradictory, and the court used a very weak language to express its rationale, and he used the double negative. We cannot find as unfounded, we cannot disagree with the military judgment, not something so assertive or positive. And it's like in 2 weeks we're going to have Valentine's Day, and if you went home and told your significant other, I cannot say I do not love you, I don't think that would go over very well. And it just proves how weak the court's decision was, and the language reflects that weakness both as a principle of law and as a holding in a decision.
Now let's jump to over 40 years later. What led up to the movement to ultimately vacate Fred's conviction?
Japanese Americans were deeply shamed by having to go to camps, being branded as disloyal, branded as an enemy. And so they hoped to forget, and they went home to the West Coast. Some were dispersed to other places, but simply wanted to rebuild their lives as Americans that they had wished that they had been perceived as. And so for 40 years, most Japanese Americans really didn't talk about this experience. It was deeply painful to them as well. I think the fire of the Civil Rights Act ignited the civil rights movement, ignited the imagination of Americans of Japanese ancestry and Asian Americans and all people of color. And they started to explore their history, and they started to remember the camps and why they were interned or incarcerated was a big question, because they knew they did nothing wrong. So as they questioned their own history, they discovered information that the government probably had no good reason, which they already knew in their hearts, but had no good reason to take them to prison for indefinite confinement without any due process rights at all. So as they started looking at their history, they began a movement led by Japanese Americans, but eventually joined by Americans of all color, to obtain redress and reparations from the government. They wanted foremost an apology. Secondly, they demanded monetary compensation, if not just token compensation, at least symbolic compensation for the great wrong that they felt that they had suffered. So Japanese Americans began a movement to petition the Congress to issue a law called the Redress Act, which granted them this type of reparations. And that started in the early 70s. So bills were introduced in Congress to grant Japanese Americans reparations, and after a protracted struggle through the 1980s, Congress finally passed this bill.
So Dale, how did you personally get involved in representing Korematsu in overturning his conviction?
I was a private practice in Oakland, California at the time, ironically, and I got a call from Professor Peter Irons, who told me that he had discovered evidence that the United States Supreme Court was defrauded in 1944 when they issued the Korematsu decision. Peter told me he had discovered evidence that the United States Supreme Court was lied to and defrauded in the case of Korematsu versus the United States, Hirabayashi and Yasui. And he told me that he wanted to reopen these cases. I asked him what evidence did he have, and he produced remarkable memos, letters from the government's own attorneys telling their superiors that we are telling outright lies in the United States Supreme Court, and it would be highly unfair to this racial minority group if those lies go uncorrected. They also said this conduct approximates the suppression of evidence. So Peter had learned that the United States Supreme Court was being told lies, and that the government officials even knew that. And yet they ignored these lawyers, continued to tell lies in the Supreme Court about the loyalty of Japanese Americans, about acts of espionage and sabotage which were alleged to have occurred but never occurred, and about the rationale, the military justification for the Japanese American incarceration, a justification which ignored the fact that not one Japanese American was ever arrested, charged, or convicted of espionage or sabotage. I was stunned by this information, and we set up a work team meeting with them where we decided to meet. I then recruited people that I knew in Portland and Seattle, where the other men were convicted, and we set about on a mission to overcome or overturn these convictions so wrongfully obtained by the United States government.
Thank you. So when they found this smoking gun, basically this evidence, I understood you organized a legal team of about 15 attorneys. What kinds of opposition did you face within the community or externally to attempting to vacate these convictions?
These cases were very difficult. We're retrying history essentially 40 years before, so we needed a huge group of people together. And it was also very controversial because these cases are landmark cases that are read by every law student just about. And they stand for the proposition, nakedly speaking, that you could uproot an entire race of people, take them away to prison for indefinite confinement without notice of the charges, the right to an attorney, or even a hearing. And so the work we had to do was spectacularly difficult, but we kept it in secret for a long time because we didn't want the government to, quote, lose any of the other evidence, which was lost earlier in the cases. We did not go public, but somehow some folks found out about our project, specifically ex-Supreme Court Justice Arthur Goldberg. And he had written an article saying it would be foolhardy for us to pursue this claim. In the midst of Japanese Americans trying to get redress, if we lost these cases, it would be a setback for all the efforts in Congress. It would be a setback for public relations. It would be a validation of the principle that we thought was essentially racist. And not only him, but I think other folks were worried that we were going to lose the cases. And you know, we knew the evidence. We knew that we were on a righteous cause. It was probably the wisdom of fools we had because we did not think for a minute that we were going to lose these cases.
Well, I'm just trying to understand, you know, as young lawyers back then, what gave you sort of the cockiness or arrogance to go forward with this very complex legal action?
I think number one is that we were really dumb, and we didn't appreciate perhaps the difficulties involved, but what we did have on our side were the things that we needed. One is we had smoking gun evidence. You rarely get the opportunity to have memos admitting that they're wrong by the own government officials, which we had. Number two, we had a wonderful judge that we had known for years to be smart, strong, liberal, and would give us a fair shot. And so we thought we had not just the law on our side, we had the judge on our side, and perhaps more, we had a sense of destiny, a sense of a mission, that what was done to Japanese Americans was so wrong that if this nation cannot correct their own errors, that we are all in trouble. And so we had that, not only the emotional feeling, but we also had, the specific factual basis and the context of having a wonderful judge on our behalf.
And this was U.S. District Judge Marilyn Patel, correct?
Yes, correct.
And she is married to a South Asian Indian American individual. Can you tell me just a little bit about Judge Patel?
Judge Patel was appointed by President Clinton, and I had known her personally over the years, appeared in courts before, even had written a letter in support of her for her appointment to the district court. Although we were not friends and we didn't see each other, she was married to a South Asian man and practiced immigration law, was a former general counsel for the National Organization of Women, which is how we knew that she was going to be somebody who would probably be sympathetic to what we were claiming.
And so on that final day, when Judge Patel is ruling on the Korematsu case, can you tell us the reaction in the courtroom once she announced the decision to vacate his conviction?
It was a blustery November day in 1983, I remember, and the judge had to move the courtroom to the ceremonial courtroom because so many people wanted to attend. The press was there, television. We had half of the audience was probably composed of Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during World War II, and they wanted to have their one day in court. I argued and started my argument with saying, we're here today to seek a measure of justice denied to Fred Korematsu and the Japanese American people some 40 years ago. We continued the argument, and at the end of the argument, Judge Patel issued a ruling. And in this ruling, she found that the United States officials had misrepresented the evidence. They had altered, suppressed, and destroyed relevant evidence that would have changed the outcome of the case. And that the decision to incarcerate Japanese Americans was not based on military necessity, that the decision was tinged by racism, and therefore the conviction of Fred Korematsu was also tainted. And with those words, she threw out his conviction and said, your conviction is now reversed. The courtroom erupted in typical Japanese American style with slight gasps and applause and a lot of muffled cries as well. And I approached Fred immediately after it was over, and I said, Fred, congratulations. We were standing up, and Fred looked at me blankly. And he said, what happened? I said, Fred, you won. You won your case. And he just looked again blankly and said, that's good. That's good. And I think the stress of having to bear the weight of being the person who caused the Supreme Court to rule against his people, imprison his people during World War II, was so difficult to bear after 40 years. It was hard for him to accept or comprehend the significance of what had just happened.
Now, you had described to me personally as Fred being almost a reluctant hero, but today we recognize Fred Korematsu Day. So I wanted you to be able to talk now about the context of why is Korematsu Day important? What lessons do we want to teach and educate our communities about? Looking at the story of Korematsu and then bringing that forward to today.
Fred was initially reluctant to bring his case to the public, but once he did, we encouraged him to then talk to the press, and at one point we said, Fred, we really need your help to publicize what we're doing. We need to educate this American public about what really happened. So the crew of 60 Minutes came by, and of course Fred was able to, by then, articulate very clearly, why he felt when he was doing what he was doing. And I think the lessons of Fred's case and Gordon and Min, the companion cases as well, are legion. I mean, you could talk about the courage of one individual. The standing up, one person can make a difference in this world by taking a courageous stand. I think you could make the point also that disloyalty is not the enemy, that dissent is not the enemy of loyalty. That in 1942, very few people stood up to dissent against the decision to incarcerate Japanese Americans, and we experienced a nationwide civil rights disaster. Later on, when redress got passed, Americans of all colors stood together and got a bill passed. And it shows you the value of dissent, because in 1942, Fred was reviled, he was ostracized, but now we know he's a hero. And so those years have proven Fred Korematsu and Gordon and Min right. And so I think those are some of the lessons. I think the most significant one, perhaps, although they're all significant, is that justice is not self-executing. Justice is not a gift, it's a challenge. That we must continue to fight for these rights, because the institutions we have, as good as they may be, cannot sustain your rights at a time of crisis. So I think it's up to us to be activists. It's up to us to support each other, because when one rights go challenged, it's everybody's rights that are challenged.
As a final question, is there any message that you want to give to Georgians and Southerners and Asian Americans, especially in the South, what lessons we can take away from Korematsu Day? We are here today in the birthplace of the Civil Rights Movement, with Martin Luther King Jr. being born in Atlanta. Can you bring together a message for us in the South?
I was surprised, honestly, when I heard that Georgia passed a resolution for Fred Korematsu Day. I mean, this is the Deep South, where the discredited institutions of segregation and slavery existed for so many years. And you have a Korean American representative from Georgia passing a resolution with the help of Caucasians, Latinos, blacks, Asian Americans, to honor a Japanese American in California, 3,000 miles away. And to have that kind of unity, to have that kind of sense of justice, to me tells me that Georgia is standing up for the Constitution, Georgia is standing up for civil rights, and to me it makes me proud to be here in Georgia.
Thank you so much, Dale. And while we'll miss you next week, we will be so excited to have Karen Korematsu herself join us in Georgia to celebrate this very special day. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.